Hello and welcome to a discussion of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This, I guess we'll consider it part of the literary side hustle. We didn't quite put it on the wheel and plan it, just happened because a bunch of us had read it at various points in the last year and a half, and some others wanted to read it and talk about it. So here we are. The next literary side hustle is going to be on American Psycho, like we talked about during the, what discussion was it? 1984 discussion. And that will probably happen sometime October, early November. With me, of course, I have the usual group of friends. Jared, could you start us off with intros?
I am Jared, the runner of the Fantasy Thinker YouTube channel and member of Speculative Speculation Podcast and a whole bunch of different stuff on pagechewing.com, like this fine podcast you're listening to here. Steve?
Chris?
Okay. Somebody.
Go, Chris.
Okay, I'll go next. My name's Chris Mullen from the Chronicle of Chris YouTube channel and from said Speculative Speculations podcast. And for those in audio, Varsha's eating at the moment, so can't do introductions, so I'll say Steve.
Very nice. I love how Varsha said, we just decided to read this book. It's like, no, like Varsha told us we're reading Frankenstein. That's how this all happened.
Yes.
But anyway, I am Steve from Page Chewing and Steve Talks Books and pagechewing.com and Speculative Speculations and lots of other things that I can't remember all at once, but it's going to be a good discussion. And Varsha's done eating, so
yes.
Varsha can go next.
For the moment. Hi, I'm Varsha, and you can find me on the YouTube channel Reading by the Rainy Mountain and hustling people into doing side hustles like this. I think all of us, Steve, you read it the most recently. So do you want to start us off with some high-level thoughts?
I don't know about high level, but
oh, okay.
If you're looking for high level, you called the wrong person. But no, I think it was more interesting when I looked into Mary Shelley's own history. But I was surprised at all the questions this rose for me with the monster and Frankenstein. And I know people are gonna groan when I say this, but I think it's one of those stories that are relatable in any time period. It's in our time period. I think it's that question of, yes, we can do it, but should we? Mm. And I'm gonna come back, as I usually do, to AI and creating, because it is almost a monster that we're creating. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, yes, we can do it. Yes, there are these technological advances. We can do it, but should we? And also with other advances in cloning and there's lots of other scientific discoveries. And is it better to not tempt fate, to push science to the limits and to evolve? I think some would say evolve and to advance and to progress as a civilization, or is it better to just remain as we are and take our subjective experiences and life lessons in on our own and leave it at that? So there's that. If we want to advance, we have to keep pushing ourselves further, but at what cost? And also there's a whole angle of playing God, of creating life, and you can also kind of view this as children too, because you're creating life, and because you can, should you? I mean, that's a question I think every parents ask themselves at some point. But yeah, so I think there's lots of different angles you can come from this, and lots of different great kind of ways to process the story and what it all means, and relate it to current. It's a timeless story.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. And
of all the things that you mentioned, the atomic bomb, I think, even more than AI, stood out to me, especially because of the remorse the creator has in what he created. I think Oppenheimer comes to mind. I don't know, that one I'm sort of aware of, but any other people who potentially worked on the atomic bomb who also felt regret after the fact. And there is that question too, just because you can, should you, with the atomic bomb as well. And I think it does have a lot of parallels to modern reality as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because you wonder. I mean, this has been the model in literature for that very question about how far we should take things, and like anything written after this time that deals with the same subject always gets compared to Frankenstein, and but it makes you wonder what Mary Shelley saw in science, particularly, that made her put out this big warning of be careful what you create. At the time, because it's like 33 or something like that.
1818, right?
1818,
Yeah.
and what was she looking at that scared her enough to make this scary Frankenstein's monster, this Prometheus, and it wasn't the invention of electricity wasn't even really a thing yet. So what was the inventions? Was it better armaments? Was it what was it that made her delve into this subject so good?
I think it was during the scientific revolution. I think that's the time period that was written in. I'm not sure exactly what advances were being made, but it was during the time where they were making some advances in science and pushing the limits, looking to science more than our own subjective experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's some mention of Percy Shelley, their husband, playing with electricity in the formative years in the introduction of the book as well, and almost like that Columbia horror style of the glasses filling up with electricity, the kind of all of the kind of movement that creates. I think what's really interesting for me about the novel and when I read it is that somehow it's the common perception of the story has morphed from what it actually is. If you know what I mean. So if you were to ask anybody in the street, do they know Frankenstein or the story of Frankenstein, they will almost certainly say yes. They will tell you the story of Frankenstein, but it ain't this story. It ain't. The themes of this book are not the themes that the 1930s movies sort of looked at and more, visually anyway. That kind of very poster feel of be terrified of the monster kind of thing. Those themes are not the themes are of the book. And further to your points, I think it also deals quite heavily with the idea that not only should we, but also when you do create, do you get the right to disavow yourself or separate yourself from the invention and not follow through with the consequences of your actions? Can you, if you have the hubris enough to go to a certain place, do you ever have the right to step away from it and say, actually, I'm not happy where this is going anymore when it's already done? And I think a lot of those things are the things that really I attach to within the story. And one last point that is a good question to spring off for everybody else here. It's sometimes called the first science fiction novel, right? And I was expecting more science fiction in it, or more science in general in it, but it sort of eschews most of that stuff, for me anyway. There is ever so light references to like the work of Isaac Newton and kind of comparing himself to that litany of kind of great scientists because of his own hubris, etc., but not actually into the creation of Frankenstein's monster and all that kind of part itself that I was expecting in the book, but sort of is glossed over with. So I'm not quite sure that I see it as a science fiction other than a thematic kind of link to science fiction.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Jared. I was going to say, in as much as science fiction is it's fiction of ideas and thought experiments, I think science is fairly loose, or maybe it's not. I don't know what the state of science was at the time. She tries to make alchemical explanations. Maybe alchemy was the science of the time. So maybe for its time it is science fiction. But in terms of the thought experiment aspect of it and the ideas that are explored here, it does read very much like some of the masterworks that we've read, wherein an idea is presented and then we explore all the consequences from it.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that very same thing, Basha. It's more about the idea that a man could use the concepts of science to create life and to create something that was above and beyond what was known in society at the time, and to advance the idea of what science can do, even without the approval of the society that the scientist was in. I mean, for good reason, the guy was a madcap, but so it, like, I was going to say the same thing as Vasha said. It's like there's quite a few of those masterworks we've read where the science part of the fiction was kind of a little lacking, and it was more fiction. You know me, I think it's a great fantasy. This book is a wonderful fantasy novel, and of course it falls into the genre of horror. Which of course comes from the appellation of being gothic, the gothic novel that was very popular at the time.
That reminds me, I think, following up on what you said, Chris, I think I didn't quite know what to expect. I had heard it called the first science fiction novel, so I didn't think it would be primarily the horror that I think we've now come to believe that the story probably is. But yeah, I wasn't prepared for how deeply philosophical it was in many aspects, and yeah, we'll get to the parts about Frankenstein and the monster, but even in the beginning about how science should be done, and also the aspects of what defines a scientist's self-worth, like being able to do something with their life, the opening with the brother and what he is willing to put at stake to complete his mission, which we technically know nothing about, but we know that it's something that he's willing to put his life and the lives of several others at risk over. And also the aspects of how science should be done. I think one particular thing that really stood out to me was a conversation that Frankenstein has with one of his professors, where the professor tells Frankenstein that sure, this is what you want to focus on, but you won't be a very good scientist in this field if you don't broaden your scope and study all these other subjects that might feed into what you need to do. And that really spoke to me because I feel like I'm not a scientist myself, but I feel like some of the tendency in the way we do science recently is to hyper focus on individual aspects, but maybe losing the bigger picture that we're trying to solve, or not sufficient focus, in my opinion. So that part really stood out. And of course the scientist's career, I think those, besides the main themes of the monster and the creator that were explored, that really stood out to me.
Yeah, the whole angle of playing God and creating life from nothing, and Frankenstein shuns the monster, and after it's created, and so I guess that the question is, whose fault is it? The wrongs that the monster did, is it the monster's fault? Is the monster a clean slate that's reacting from its experiences, or is it Victor Frankenstein's fault because he created the monster and he shunned it and he didn't take it in? He had a few chances to try to right his, I guess you could say, right his wrongs, and he didn't. So who's to blame? Is it everyone? Is it, I mean, is you feel for the monster, but then you remember all the things he did, so it's can't explain it all, right?
Yeah, I think this what it reminded me of the most of the parts with the monster and the evil that he did was Child of God, incidentally, which we also read for this podcast, because some of the themes there, I think, resonate here with the monster. It's essentially a very big child, and he was left out of the world to do what he could and to survive the best way he could, and he wanted affection any way he could get it, and this is what he resorted to. Yes, there is some personal responsibility involved there, but also it's the responsibility of the rest of the world to treat him right, or who didn't treat him right, which led to some of his actions. So I think there's definitely this element of shared responsibility that I think was also explored in Child of God, and that's what this most reminded me of. Yes, it's easy to hate the monster because he went around killing people, but what about the fact that he tried so hard to fit in before that and failed because nobody would, like the people he tried to save in that little hut when he was living there, they saw him and immediately judged him based on how he looked, and that was it. That was the extent of what they saw. So there is some shared culpability here, for sure. And I love how that was explored. Like, Shelley doesn't come out and tell us that this is how it is. She presents the points of view of the monster and the points of view of Frankenstein. Neither of them is fully right or wrong. I think we are left to grapple with it, which I think is one of the wonderful things about this book.
Yeah, and it's amazing how young she was when she wrote this, and how much of what we're talking about and the wisdom that she put into all those explorations of with the monster. It's people judging a book by its cover. Basically, they see the ugly monster, they react to the ugly monster, they treat it like an ugly monster, even though the monster hadn't yet done anything to be a monster. And it wasn't until they reacted to him in such a way that he actually became that monster. And so to have that depth of perception into character at this, I know it was a very young age. I don't remember the age at which she actually wrote it, but I know she was very young. And to have that kind of depth into character at such a young age, and to be able to bring together all the other themes that she brought to this book is simply incredible. I think it's one of my favorite books because of how subtle it is in all this exploration of what she does. And I'm always amazed by that.
She was 18 when she wrote Frankenstein.
That sounds crazy to me. That's like my kids writing a novel like this. I can't even picture it.
Yeah. And
I think it's even more amazing when you think about her mother died during childbirth, and her father didn't teach Mary Shelley how to read, or didn't give her she did receive an education. So she learned how to read and write on her own. So it makes it's even more amazing.
At least they were a literary family. But what's really incredible about it is, as Steve alluded to at the very start, is how a lot of the ideas and themes and thoughts mirror her life story to that point, and her thinking and her relationships with adults, partners, people around her all the time. And it's all like baked into this novel in its own little small way, but told in a fantastical way, as you quite rightly said, Jared.
Yeah, and to be able to transpose that life experience into a story in the manner that she did, in such a high level of metaphor, in representation on that, in that way is incredible. And I think it's a part of the, I don't know, but to me it's part of the reason why fantasy literature is so great, because you can do that. You can do that at that high level of metaphor and that high, explain things about life without actually talking about real life events, but still in a way talking about real life events. And it's just this is a perfect example of one of the greatest ways to do that, and that's why I love it so much.
And it's another good example, even though this kind of genre fiction is sort of derided a little bit. We have seen in the past two books that we've done, even alone, between 1984 and Frankenstein, two of the most incredibly written books, not in terms of just metaphor and prose, but in ideas and exploration of the humanity and kind of what we do now influencing our future, standing up and making choices for ourselves. Like, they're really, really strong advocacies for really taking responsibility for who you are and what you do and your role in society and all of that kind of stuff in ways that you know, I was going to say you don't see as much outside that genre, but certainly they're great examples within all literary fiction of exactly that those ideas.
Yep. And again, I think with a lot of the masterworks that from the beginning of the 20th century and this one, it's amazing how relevant the themes are to today's times. Like, especially with, I think Steve talked about AI before, but in terms of not like it becoming a monster, but more the responsibility you have towards your creation, like you pointed out, Chris. I think there are several more modern pieces that explore your responsibility to your creations. Several books come to mind. Like, I think La Vie de Dar does that in several of his novels. Tchaikovsky did in a couple of his. And I think The Devil Delivered, that we just read for a discussion on Jared's channel today, that also goes into it. It is a very small part of that book, but it explores that. When you create something that is seemingly sentient, if it, say, passes the Turing test, do you not owe it the same respect you owe another human? I think the tendency that is explored typically is to not give it respect and make it prove that it is worthy of it, which is what the monster is put through here. So I think it also is relevant towards our responsibility to if and when AI is sentient, or anything that we create that is like us, like clones, for instance, the responsibility that we owe them, that is explored in more modern sci-fi, I think could also be taken as one of the things that are explored in this novel.
Yeah, and a lack of responsibility that Dr. Frankenstein takes is the more horrific aspect of one of the more horrific aspects of the story itself, and how he twists his view on what the monster was, he created, how he twisted in his own mind to make it this horrible thing that he should never have done. You know, he does a complete 180 compared to when he wanted to create it, and he was so mad about creating it, and you know, doing it with without his, you know, under the, you know, through trickery, you know, and then later being totally against what he did, and like you said, not taking responsibility. That is kind of the what a lot of people at the time were worried about with science, with electricity, with alchemy and stuff like that. At the time, people were really worried about that stuff, because it was new, it was different, it was unexplored, it was unknown, and only some of the top scientists in the world were playing with this stuff. And so that whole reflection of what it like a backlash to progress at the time, and that's pretty much what all the romantic literature, the Gothic romantic literature, was focused on at the time. That it's pretty much what horror grew out of, was that backlash to progress, to scientific progress specifically.
There's also a strong sense of it being a masculine problem. Like, masculinity in this competition and the way to impose yourself and control yourself in the earth is a very masculine problem, and that everybody else has to deal with the problems caused by males in science. For instance, you know, the notoriety of progress in there is about that, and I've seen a couple of further readings all concentrate on the kind of Shelley view of, was she talking about problems with males in her life, because relationship with her father, with her relationship with Percy Shelley in her marriage, etc. Was she already feeling trapped? Like, she was a young 18-year-old woman, but she had lived a lot of life, and a lot of things had happened to her by that stage of her life, and maybe it was just a vehicle to channel those emotions, even rather than a criticism, of the things that had happened to her.
And I guess the intellectual pursuit to the exclusion of all else, like, there is a period that Frankenstein goes through where he doesn't communicate with his family at all because he's so focused.
That's right.
Perhaps the men in her life went through that as well, when they neglected family in favor of intellectual pursuits. What was I going to say? Yeah, and the scene in which Frankenstein grapples with, or several scenes, I guess, the pages over which Frankenstein grapples with deciding whether to create a companion for his monster, like he begs him to do. I think, yeah, that goes through all the things that you might think of in that situation. Right, he has responsibility towards his creation, but also, although I don't think he ever deals with that. He doesn't actually acknowledge the fact that he has this responsibility. He only thinks of the responsibility he has to the world to not unleash these creations on them, but completely neglects the monster, his responsibility towards the monster. But those pages where he explores that option, I think were phenomenal. The other thing that really stood out to me in this book is the structure. That was one of my favorite things. The letter, the monster's narration within the journals, within the letters that are written to the sister. I think that was fantastic. And I don't know if that sort of structuring was common for the novels of that time, but it felt ingenious to me. I haven't read very many that have the story within story within story structure, and how it was done. Like, it's not the same kind of story within story. It's letters and then novel and narration. So
yeah, it's a frame structure. That's what they call it, a framing narrative, and where you cap each end of the story with the beginning and the end is one character's perspective, or one POV, or what have you. And then the as it goes on, it goes kind of in to the next part of the story, and usually it's just one thing, like you start off a story with, I heard a story once and I'm going to tell you about it, and here's what I was told, and then it goes to the character that's telling the story to this person who is telling you the story, so to speak. And then at the end of the story, it goes back to him and it says, and that's what I was told, and so on and so forth. But she's so much more subtle about it and uses it to such great effect that it stands above anything. It was a common device during the times, especially in the gothic romantic literature genres at the time. But she uses it to such great effect that it's become synonymous with Frankenstein, specifically because you have that wonderful writing of that opening letter from what's his name, the guy.
Yeah, interesting. I don't remember
the
name
guy who
of
had
the
the sister. Yeah, and who's getting
Walton.
this. Walton, yeah, Robert Walton, and yeah, he's the one telling the story to his sister in the letters, and he's getting that from Victor, who then is getting some of the story from the monster himself in the center of the framing narrative, and then it goes back out to Victor, and then it goes back out to Walton in this beautiful structure that you'll find hard pressed to see anything replicated in such a wonderful manner as this novel. The other books do it, but it's amazing that nobody's really topped it since that. Maybe I just haven't read the right stuff, but.
It's incredible that its first few reviews didn't think it was very good. You know, it was released in 1818 or whatever it was. The initial response to it was like, no, not great. And actually, even after that fact, when people did say that it was that it had merit and value, they started saying, well, obviously Percy wrote this. You know, this was Percy had a big influence on this.
Yeah.
It couldn't have come from her, and it took John Polidori, Lord Byron, etc. To actually speak up and say, no, that weekend in Vienna, which is dramatised in a kind of some movie called Gothic, if anybody ever wants to watch it. It's mental, but it's an interesting representation of the events of that weekend, of them writing their own ghost stories. Very interesting.
Oh, so this was born out of an exercise to write ghost stories.
Yes, so there were 4 people that went to
Interesting.
a house. It was in Vienna, I'm pretty sure it was. It put John Polidori, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, and Mary Shelley, and they kind of they wanted to basically set themselves a writing challenge, that they would all read a ghost story, and they pretty much all accepted that Shelley's Mary Shelley's was the best of the 4, and then Percy encouraged her to turn it into a full novel because it only had like 4 pages or something from the weekend.
Interesting. I wonder what part of the story was that short story, because there are some pretty horrific parts where I keep coming back to this losing responsibility over what you create, because I'm so mad at Frankenstein. He created the monster, he woke up, and then he left, went back to his room and hid. And then the monster shows up at his window and looks in. That scene, if you weren't angry at Frankenstein for just leaving the guy alone, was horrifying, where the monster peeks in at the window. So yeah, I suppose I can see some scenes that are horror.
So a question for everyone.
Oh boy.
Should Frankenstein had created a partner for the monster at that point?
It's the big philosophical question of the book, isn't it? Because in that case, you as the reader get to make a choice for Victor Frankenstein, if you know what I mean. You kind of make it a definite choice, because he basically is asking his inner self, but he's really asking the reader to say, should he? I'm sure I'm just like everybody else reading the book. I bounce back and forward and going, yes, he should, but actually that would mean so no. But you went there in the first place. But you shouldn't compound your own mistake. You know, that kind of back and forward. And I think ultimately, he failed the monster early on, even though he knew he needed to take responsibility and showed compassion and love, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. This was him basically opting out and finding an easy way out. In some ways, creating things so basically somebody else take it off my hands and take the responsibility. I've done what's right for it, and you can kind of see some, again, parallels of that throughout life, where people kind of made a mistake and compounded the mistake by doing something else to absolve themselves of that. I ultimately think he should have, but he also should have been supported. You know, it should have been also supporting his creation in whatever way, because the creation became a menace to society in some ways, and to himself then ultimately.
Yeah, you're right, Chris. The 2 wrongs don't make it right. So making another thing like this might be a big mistake. Probably would be a big mistake. But the buried deep within me, that evil scientist is saying, yeah, he should have made a whole bunch more. but
family.
I think there is a third way, though. The monster wanted a companion. That's why he asked for another one like himself. But really, he could have done if the people that he was watching from the hut that he camped out in had been kind to him. And Frankenstein was in a position to give him that kindness. And he was, I forget at this point if he was already married or going to marry, but he had a companion who probably would have understood if he had told her, given how he described her. So they could have been the family that the monster wanted, and so absolved himself of the responsibility of creating another one, and possibly other evil things the monster might do, because you paid the price anyway. Your wife died because of the monster, so why not? I guess that never even occurred to him, but he could have given him kindness. That's all he wanted. And I think the monster even says, like, I forget if he directly makes the comparison to I'm your child and you left me without parents, but they could have been said parents, and maybe help the monster cut out some of his baser instincts that made him want to kill that child.
Yeah, but I think the inherent nature of Dr. Frankenstein's character, his inbred selfishness and hubris, I don't think he had the capacity to actually be a companion to this monster, to be kind to this monster. Mm-hmm. He was definitely not the right guy to do that, and I don't even think he had the capacity to think that far where he said, oh, maybe I can just find you a friend rather than build you one. And that's part of Mary Shelley's genius in creating this character, knowing these faults that this guy had, and how this was not going to be an easy situation because of this guy's faults, and because he couldn't make that simple leap that Varsha just made. That there's definitely a third way out of this. There's definitely a way to go about this that doesn't involve all the conflict and strife that it came to. And I don't think Dr. Frankenstein had that capacity, and I think that's part of the character that Shelley created in order to reflect what she wanted to get to tell in this story, and it's part of the genius of the story too.
Just think, how many lives would it have saved if you would have created him a partner?
Maybe
he would have maybe just like disappeared and lived happily ever after with his bride.
But I mean, it comes back to
like, well, create us a whole town.
The other big question then, as you just both sort of alluded to, is the fact, if those people had been nice to Frankenstein, would have everything have been different, or would it just have delayed the inevitable? Because a bit like you were saying about Victor Frankenstein, inherent nature meant that he didn't matter what he did, he was just that person. He wasn't emotionally attached to it. He could never bring himself, no matter how much his scientific head that he knew that he should. I think at the other end of it, the monster was born out of death. He was a thing that was dead and was very quick to return things to death when it didn't go right. It was almost as if the monster became indignant. I have made these changes, I am doing this, and people won't accept me for who I am, so I'm forced with no other choice than to exact revenge or murder or anything, when in much the same way he again had a choice, although being from a very childlike, he's very much a product of his experiences. But I think in its own right, that with the bride, no bride, I think the outcome is still the same because of the rest of humanity and how they see him and treat him.
Yeah, he'd have to isolate him pretty deeply to not expose him to hate from everyone else. But on the other hand, what the monster was begging for is just a little bit of kindness, which no one has showed him yet. So maybe that would have been sufficient to cut out his baser instincts.
Yeah, and that's interesting, Chris, that you bring that up, because I don't know if you saw Kenneth Branagh's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the movie, where he did kind of explore that. He explored giving him the companion and what the consequences of that would be, and it didn't work out so well. In that movie, which I thought was great at the time when I watched it. I've since watched it again, and you find a lot of flaws with it, but he tried to be faithful to the book up until that point where he did have him create the companion. But
did the wife survive? And the friend?
I don't remember.
Can't remember anymore.
I can't remember who killed who and who survived, and but
yeah, and I think that makes sense that it wouldn't play out very well, not because they are inherently evil like Frankenstein postulates, but more because the whole monster family isn't likely to receive any love from any humans that they run into, because the default reaction is that of revulsion, and so they will never feel like they can be accepted. And sure, he says, I'll go live in the mountains, but eventually they have to make their way down if they end up having a family and reproducing, like Frankenstein theorizes. So yeah, it is not an easy choice to make, and I think Frankenstein grappled with it for the appropriate amount of time before deciding, or like sufficiently to make me happy that he didn't just decide, no, I'm not doing this. He's not playing God, which he is, but like not with impunity.
But if he's going to create the bride, couldn't he have made it so it's not possible for them to reproduce?
That's true, and I feel like he had some he wasn't fully sure how it worked, just that it did. So I think he was uncertain of his ability to create a female who could not reproduce. But I could be wrong about that. I got the impression that yeah.
Yeah, I mean, during the monsters story that he was telling, I'm trying to remember, I think the monster was even frightened of himself at points, and because he realized that he was so different from everybody else, and so there was some psychological exploration of that, because of course we can't imagine what that would be like to suddenly be alive from something dead. It's not that's out there. That's the real fantasy part of it. So and what would that do also? How would a companion also grapple with that fact? The monster took some time to grapple with that fact because he was childlike. He was reborn in a way, and he took time to grapple with that, and he got the reactions he did from the villagers and from the whoever else he encountered. And he spent a lot of time coming to terms with that, and if a companion was made, how would that go? Would the companion come to terms in the same way that he did, or would it be more of a visceral, immediate, violent reaction, or would it be, more confused? Would it be, there's a whole bunch of questions there that of course neither one of them probably considered, but I'm sure. I think Dr. Frankenstein might have had that on the back of his mind and part of his refusal to do it. And so it's interesting concepts.
One of those classic what if or if only things. If only this had happened, then this wouldn't have happened, or this would have happened. It's like the idea that I keep on thinking to myself. If only somebody gave me like £10,000, my money problems would be for the rest of my life. That kind of idea, when in actual fact, if somebody gave me £10,000 or dollars, I'd still have money problems in the future. That doesn't change the inherent
more.
Okay, 20,000.
I need a lot more.
A million,
more
whatever. But yeah, okay. But whatever that amount of money is, or if only I had, if only Everton won the league this year, I'd be happy for that year. That kind of if only. And I feel like a lot of that runs through this book as well. This kind of idea that everybody feels injustice or feels hard done by in some way, and it as a way to explain their actions.
Mm-hmm. And that's how we meet him, right? In this sense of utter desperation and loss, where he's the ominous thread throughout that he has lost everything he has ever loved, and we just find out when that happens in the course of the telling of the story, but we know that something really bad happened because we found him in really desperate straits. I think that also lends itself to a lot of speculation about, like, if I had made a different decision here, if I had made a different decision there, maybe if I hadn't built the monster at all.
Well, I think that's the point, though. The building of the monster is the only free choice without consequence or without kind of predated or predication in the thing. Because as soon as that monster was created, there was a sequence of events then set off that kind of led to the events that came afterwards, and it was just that, again, that very first idea, like the creation of the atom bomb, like the creation of anything like that, you know. Those kind of systems or otherwise, you know. Once the cat's out of the bag, you can't stop it.
Yeah, you can't just wash your hands and go hide in your hostel room.
I think, Varsha, to your point about no one gave him kindness, couldn't he have somewhere along the way given him kindness and maybe turned this all around? And I guess you have the whole nature versus nurture debate too, because it was the monster a clean slate when he was created, or was he did he have some preconceptions? Because he did have to learn hot and cold, and you know, so he seems like he was like a blank slate, and he was a product of the way that he was being treated. So
I agree.
It's a sad story.
Yeah, it really is. Right. That, I mean, the monster didn't wake up and say, "I need to kill it." It's like, it wasn't a zombie. It lived in society. It hid from society, but it and I think it didn't even kill the girl willfully, right? She just refused to give him something, and he tried to take it from her, and he was stronger than he thought, and she died. So. And once he saw the damage that could do and how he could use it to hurt people when they refuse to give him things, like any child who learns to throw tantrums to get what it wants, he started threatening to kill people in exchange for some kindness. So it wasn't its default instinct to go murder, which, yes, I do believe that Frankenstein could potentially have turned things around quite a lot if he hadn't run from there, or after the fact listened to the monster and given him some damn kindness.
I think Varsha self-identifies with these experiences too much. The tantrums, if only I had got a bit of kindness.
I need to kill.
Yeah, but that goes back to Victor's character. Was he capable of that? You know, and I don't think he was capable of that kind of kindness. He was too self-involved. He was too selfish. He was too focused on his goal and what he wanted to accomplish, to the detriment of all else. And then you go back to the villagers that originally encountered the monster. They kind of represented something that was too ignorant of what was out there. They were too superstitious of what is, you know, in the woods beyond, and what's out there, what's the other beyond, you know, what they're living in their little shell of village or protection or whatever. And so the opportunities for the monster to have that kindness were so nil. They were limited. They weren't available readily. Who else could have given him that kindness? And I think that's a question that maybe Shelley was asking. Who else could have given kindness to a creature or a being or a person in that situation? Maybe that's a question she was asking about herself. Who knows? But it might be a question that we all ask. Who could have? These people couldn't have. Victor could not have. It just wasn't in his nature. It wasn't in his character. The villagers couldn't have. They were too blinded by fear and ignorance in order to, dole out that kind of kindness to such a foreign and other-looking being. And so that's a big question right there. How to overcome inherent biases in order to give the benefit of the doubt to something we know nothing about, in that overcoming that fear of the unknown.
The grappling with the things that the internal biases you have to struggle with to get to the point where you can accept something that looks monstrous. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. I wonder...
What else?
I wonder whether this isn't also a commentary on... Well, it could be about our husband and about our relationship, but about the suitability to be parents. Right? People do enjoy the act of reproduction, how children are being made, but don't want to accept responsibility for the outcomes of that, and who will make good parents and who will not make good parents. People that want to do one side of it but not accept responsibility of their actions. And especially given, again, we haven't really talked about it, but the fact that she had a premature baby born, died a few days later, and she had a dream actually about that baby coming back to life long before she even thought about this book. In some ways, I wonder if an awful lot of that was mixed up in a lot of her kind of processing of that emotions. Like, if that baby had been born, if it had have stayed up, would I have been a good enough parent? It might have been about her, it might have been about Percy Shelley, it might have been about her own father, it might have been about all of those things, accepting her for who she was, or the child for who she was. It feels very much wrapped up in her life without being exactly pointedly about it.
Yeah. My information is from reading Aria. I'm only halfway through that book, but we know that Godwin washed his hands off of her at some point for eloping with Shelley. So could this also be grappling with that? Like, when a parent refuses to take responsibility for their child for whatever reason.
And the same thing happened to Percy. Like, they were two very, very similar children. Like, the father eschewed responsibility, cut him off in much the same way from it, and he actually found solace in Godwin himself, as a better suitable parent. But then he stole the daughter.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think Shelley lost a few kids, right? She lost a couple. I think she only had one surviving. I think she had 2 or 3 that had died.
She did.
I think it was after writing this book, but yeah, she had lots of loss, and she even carried her husband drowned, and she carried his heart around for the rest of her life.
I had heard that one. Wow.
Oh, interesting.
And she never remarried or moved on. She was just with his heart.
That is so heartbreaking.
Heartbreaking, creepy as shit.
Especially if she dropped it.
Well, there is a certain way to look at it. I agree. I tried not to go there, but yes, I agree. It's also creepy. Yeah. I love the descriptions of the landscape in this one, with Switzerland and the mountains, where there's some lakes, and also the northern regions close to the pole. I did wonder how like, did she repeat descriptions that she had read, or had she actually traveled there or close to those regions to be able to write those descriptions?
That's where it started.
Well, wasn't there a retreat
in Vienna?
in Swiss?
That was it. At Switzerland, mightn't have been Vienna, but it was definitely around that area. And they stayed in a big manor with a lake out the front, and you know, it was a very, very beautiful part of the world. But there's no doubt, Varsha, you're right. The atmosphere that's generated, even between that, and then even in the bits in the woods and the forest, that very gothic, overbearing nature of it just kind of it creeps off the page, doesn't it? It's almost like we're talking about a monster, but all of the atmosphere and the creepiness is actually contained within the environment as much as the people.
Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. And I guess the vast emptiness of the North Pole, where they're chasing the monster, I think that was captured brilliantly.
Yeah. The isolation was.
Yeah. I just thought of another thing that I think. Yeah. The nice thing about a lot of these science fiction, if you want to call them that, books, is the number of themes or ideas that are woven in. Like, there was the brief section where someone is put on trial for killing the child, the nanny, right, the governess or whatever, and she's killed on very little evidence. She's very little, maybe it's damning evidence, but the judicial system doesn't try very hard to not kill her, right? Like, how easy it is to falsely accuse someone of a crime and then put them to death over it. That tiny exploration there also, I thought, was brilliant.
Justine.
Lockett? Yes.
Justine, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The monster put it in her pocket, right? Mm-hmm. And did he intend to have her be taken responsible for the crime? Okay.
Punishing Frankenstein.
Makes sense. But yeah, I think she has a conversation with Frankenstein's father, who wants to try and free her, and it's like, I believe in the law and you will be released, and then she's not. And that's that.
Yeah. Completely heartbreaking
I find
story.
it amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're right. I find it amazing, all the beautiful passages that she has in here, just like that, and even the very last line of the whole book, I just think is great, where it says, "He was soon borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance." And that just like gives you that sense that there's a darkness and distance in humanity, in this search for progress, in this search for a scientific answer to something that ends in death, in darkness, in distance, that isn't human. And she's kind of lashing out against that kind of thinking, and it just beautifully put and stuff like that.
Yeah. Oh, and the ending, I love that too, where I think Frankenstein dies, if I remember correctly, right? And the monster comes back and again does a big speech about how much he regretted that. That section was also
beautiful,
pretty brilliant.
Yeah, it's not a happy ending.
No.
Yeah. It's one of the most tab-worthy books I have ever read. It felt like pretty much every single line had meaning. Every line had something beautiful about it, something haunting about it. It was tinged full of emotion. I sort of had to stop myself because I was kind of going every other page with a tab mark at the side of it. I was like, well, I'm never gonna read all these if it's all tabbed.
Yeah, you can just open it up and just read a line and just be satisfied with it. And it's funny because I read this for one class when I was going to school, and and then it came up in another class as reading material, and I was like, oh, I don't want to read this again. What am I? And then I was like, all right, I'll pick it up, and and I started, and I was like, oh yeah, actually, I do want to read this again. It's really great.
Yeah. Steve, did you do audiobook or did you read it physically?
It was all audio, and I kept hearing, like you guys mentioned, I kept hearing lines, and I was like, oh, I have to go back and write that down. And then, of course, I was in the middle of, a bike ride, so I couldn't do that, obviously. But so many great lines. It was a really good narrator, too. So
yeah, Dan Stevens does the narration, I think, of that version. I did part audio for it as well, and it was terrific. Really, really good.
Oh, cool.
Nice. I have to maybe listen to the Dan Stevens one. I did. There was one version available by Simon once. I picked that one, but I did the thing. I listened to it at home, so I had the advantage of pausing and going and highlighting what I wanted to. But good story. Any other thoughts before we wrap up?
Where does it
really
rank?
Good classics for a reason?
Where does it rank amongst the books that we've read for the side hustle?
Oh, interesting question.
Oh, it's no question for me. It's number one.
I think it might be for me too. Oh, yeah. I think it does more than The Road in terms of themes. So probably this, then The Road. And did I say Road then 1984 last time? I forget. But I'd put those two the same. Blood Meridian and Child of God can be together. I won't say more.
It'd probably be number 2. I think 1984 is still my number 1.
That's fair, even though I have no
idea.
Good answer.
But this is like, this book is in my top 10 of all time. I love this book. I just absolutely love it.
Nice.
It's brilliant.
It really is.
What's the thing, Jared, you would say is the aspect of it that most made you want to put it in the top 10 list?
Well, all the things we've been talking about, and I think it's the seminal work of its time, and I think it's a work that influenced just about everything that we read today. People call it a horror story, and it's certainly influenced a lot of horror stories in its time, but I look at it and I think it's so much more than that. The horror aspects of it are horror because of the nature of the actual story itself, because of the horror of humanity and how one man's driven obsession can be so affect himself and the people around him and his creation in itself. So I think it's a little unfair to just call it a horror story and leave it at that. It's so much more, and I think it's very influential, not also on the fantastical. Every fantastic creature that's been made afterwards, whether it's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and so on and so forth on up, can trace its roots back to this. And I know Chris said there wasn't much science in it, but like you said, Vasha, the ideas of science were in there, and I think that the roots of science fiction can be traced back to those ideas as well. So I think just a sheer influence of this book on everything pretty much that's come afterwards is there, even to the writers of today. And it's a giant that is holding on its shoulders just about everything we read these days, especially in genre fiction. And I appreciate it for that, and will always treasure it for that reason.
Nice, very nice.
And that's just...
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm saying that's just a wine talking, by the way.
No. I was saying in terms of Gothic horror and Gothic literature, just for reference, this is what 1818, and Dracula was published in 1897. So almost 80 years later. So this is way ahead of its time.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? Yeah.
Interesting. Gotta put that one on the wheel too. Okay.
Wasn't a fan.
No, not a fan. Okay, then we take it off. What was I going to say? Any other closing thoughts?
Nope.
Yep. Good stuff.
Okay. In that case, we will see everybody approximately a month later with American Psycho by Brent Ellis. Is that the writer? And
Pretty Snellis.
Jared's confirming for us.
Yeah.
Yes. Brent Ellis in about a month. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. We'll see you soon. Bye.